Good to be here tonight. Appreciate those attending. We're going to talk about Lamentations 1 this evening. I've just titled it Lament 1. There's 5 chapters, but the reason I went to this book was I was up on the floor and asked one of my therapists, and I said, how are your patients this week? How's things going? And he said they're pretty sad, and I was like, sad how? And he said it's just hard to get them motivated. People are they're just sad. And I'm like, okay, I get that. So I started reading, and I thought, let's look at sadness, and let's look at grief, and let's look at lamentations. But I Googled, why is there so much sadness or so much depression right now? So Google told me that the number one thing is living the digital life and social media came up number one. And they said that people are dealing with a constant comparison in that life, and a lot of fake lives. There was a commercial that came out years ago, and it was an older retired couple who was out bike riding, and they were hiking, and they were doing all this stuff, and they were active. And then they showed their daughter, who's in her 40s, and she was kind of on social media, and she was just kind of sitting around, and she was worried about her parents, and she had 1,000 friends on Facebook, and she said, man, this is living, and I'm like, no, that's not living. Her parents, who were retired, who were, quite a bit older, were living, and I think a lot of people are just not living. And it kind of attributed that to less in-person contact. A lot of people get caught up, going down the rabbit hole. We hear that term a lot more than we used to hear that term. And people are dealing with sleep loss because they're doing that for hour upon hours. The number two thing was loneliness and modern day pressures. It was social isolation, communities. I know Tricia talks about when she was younger and they were in Ohio, everybody got together and played cards. They got together and played cards, and they fixed dinner. Well, that's foreign to me. That is not anything that I've been a part of in my lifetime. So communities are not as tight knit as they used to be. Also, people are, worried about money and competition in the workplace. A lot of people have that competition in the workplace to where, if they're not successful, they drive themselves harder and harder. And then the number third thing, that there's actually more awareness about mental health. And that kind of goes back to problem number one, the social media, because people are on there so much. But there is more screening for for mental health problems than there used to be. I always say, gone are the days of the term, just get over it. That's not a term anymore. People are afraid to go down that route. But enough of that. We'll talk about this. So the author of Lamentations is unknown. It's thought to be Jeremiah, based upon tradition, based upon his writing style. Believes that he wrote Lamentations after finishing the book of Jeremiah, with the impending destruction of Jerusalem. And he was termed the weeping prophet for that reason, because he, for many years he tried to convince Judah to change their ways. The four laments are arranged as an acrostic. Acrostic simply means alphabet, and talking about the first letter of each verse starts with the letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So here's your alphabet here. And I pulled Lamentations up in Hebrew, and I was looking because I was just curious, and I was like, that doesn't look right to me. But then you have to remember that it goes from right to left, not left to right. So it made sense after I came to that deduction. But the first symbol there, aleph, or first word, you might say, it actually means ox is the term. So say, for instance, the first four are, the first verse of everyone started with the word ox. But that word ox, and this is where Hebrew kind of gets difficult and confusing, can mean many different things. It symbolizes strength, leadership, endurance. It also represents the number one, being absolute unity and oneness with God. And it also has the meaning of master or teacher. So there's a lot to that little squiggly over on the right that goes by the term aleph. The third book has 66 verses in it, with the letters being used 3 times in a row. So it is, the first 3 verses are Aleph, 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 and then it goes Bet, 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 then Gimel, Gimel, Gimel. If you went down that rabbit hole of Hebrew letter and alphabet, which I did. But using every letter of the alphabet actually signified completeness or totality, as in Jerusalem was totally destroyed. The fifth lament also has 22 verses, but it does not use the acrostic style. So we step away from that in the fifth chapter of Lamentations. And the idea, I've read several things, the idea behind that, it moves from order to disorder in that final chapter. The idea is, I have no words or letters. It's complete sorrow or grief. The terminology, I have no words. People, that's something we actually say today, meaning you're either too shocked or you're too upset or you're too amazed to speak. And in this case, it was upset. So that's kind of the idea behind the fifth chapter of Lamentations. Webster's definition of lament is to express deep sorrow, grief, or regret. Noun, a cry of grief, wailing, or a dirge, and a verb, to mourn or regret deeply. And we have other examples of laments in the Bible. Psalms 3, 10, 13. There's other areas, and I'll talk about a couple of those later in the lesson. But the book of Lamentations, in a nutshell, written to express deep grief over the destruction of Jerusalem and to ask God to bring justice to his enemies and restoration to his people. So tonight, we have a couple of things we're going to talk about. So no comfort, which is the idea of Lamentations 1, and we'll talk about that. Permission to cry to God, and then the lesson will be yours this evening. So no comfort. Lamentations 1 focuses on the idea that there is a complete lack of comfort and loneliness. That's why I've got this guy sitting here by himself. It's just, they're distraught. They are distraught. And that lack of comfort is actually mentioned 5 times in the chapter in Lamentations 1, 2, 9, 16, 17, and 21. And his first one is, she has none to comfort her. She had no comforter, because the comforter who should restore my life is far from me. Zion spreads out her hands, but no one comforts her. And they have heard that I sigh, but no one comforts me. That repetition is that there is no comfort. They're in a bad place. They're in a bad place. No one can comfort. No one will comfort. It's far away. And I'm going to tell you, to some extent, that is where most people have the idea of grieving, of getting down on themselves, of having bouts of depression. There's nothing anyone can say. They get that in their idea. There's nothing anyone can say to make me feel any better. Or there's nothing anyone can do to help me. And people are always trying to help, but people get in their mind, there's nothing can be done for me, and there's no comfort coming. All I can see is the bad. That's the only thing that I can see. I can't see over the horizon that there is something better in my future. The idea that I can't even look in the distance and hope for comfort, but all that I have is pain, and there is no relief. But I want you to think, just for a second, it's okay to grieve. And we've all done it. We've all been there. It's okay to be sad. We've all had to deal with hardships in our life. And, to some extent, those things are tests to our faith, tests to our fortitude. God is trying to mold us into something while we're here on this earth, and try to be with him in heaven. And we have those trials that we have a choice to either grow stronger and grow closer to him, or step back and step away from him. And that's always a choice that we have. But it is acceptable to have anguish. It's acceptable to grieve. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It is part of life. And Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 2:4, it says, "For out of much affliction and anguish of heart, I wrote to you with many tears, not that you should be grieved, but that you might know the love which I have so abundantly for you." Paul was having a hard time, anguish, pain, grief, as he was doing the work that God had given him to do. He was dealing with the church in Corinth this time, defending his position of authority and as apostle. Also dealing with a thorn in the flesh. We don't know what that is, but that definitely is something uncomfortable. There's no doubt about it, because he wanted to get rid of it. But in that verse, it says, not that you should be grieved. Paul's telling you, I'm having a hard time here, but don't worry about me. I don't want you to be grieved about it. I'm fine. I'm fine. And I want you to know the love that I have so abundantly for you. You're doing a great job and I love you. I'm having a hard time, but I'm going to spend all my time on something that's beneficial. I'm grieving. I'm having a hard time, but I'm fine. And I want you to know I love you. And that's what a hard thing to do. I think when most times, if we're having a hard time, a lot of times we're not focused on someone else. Paul was focused on someone else. He was dealing with the same emotions as those he was teaching. And in the previous verse, verse 3, it says, I was with you in weakness and fear and in much trembling. He was dealing with the same stuff, the same hardships, the same trials. He was in the trenches. He wasn't in some safe place, just kind of overseeing and doing. And Jesus experienced anguish, prior to his betrayal. In Luke 22:44, it says, and being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. Then his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. Jesus was dealing with a lot at this point. His human side was dealing with a lot, knowing the pain he was going to have to deal with. Obviously he knew he was going to make it, but he still had to go through that trial. And that human side of him was struggling. And that's the only side we have. So we're going to go there. When we have grief and we have pain, that's all we know. That is all we know. When Jesus returned to his disciples, he finds them sleeping. In Luke 22:45, it says, then he rose up from prayer and had come to his disciples. He found them sleeping from sorrow. They were dealing with the same thing too. They didn't just decide, oh, Jesus, he'll be all right in there. They were doing the same thing. They were very sorrowful. And they had, I'm sure, prayed themselves into exhaustion, worried themselves into exhaustion, and they've been doing the same thing, and a Christian can and will have grief, anguish, sorrow, all those things in this life, just because we know God's plan, we know how to get there, we know what to do. Just because we're doing the right things doesn't mean hardships aren't going to come upon us. They will. They will, and it's a guarantee. The scriptures tell us so. And you're not less because of those emotions. Just because you're upset about something, going on in your life, or maybe a decision that you've made, you're not less because of that. We're not designed to be a stoic. When things are good, you should be happy, and when things are bad, you need to realize they're bad and look for comfort in those things, look for strength in those things, and grow. That's what a Christian needs to do. We need to grow from those hardships. In 1 Thessalonians 4:13, it says, but I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. They're dealing with those people who have died, and I'd say everyone in this room has had that situation. Someone close to them has passed away. But don't be ignorant in the sense that we don't know as a Christian what waits on the other side for us. Yes, we're sorrowful that they're gone, but those Christians who have gone on before us are in a much, much, much better place than we are. And we have hope. We know what that hope is. Christians grieve. They deal with sorrows and pains, but it's a different type of grief and a pain. You ever thought about this? Christians' grief is only known in this life. And I'm 56. I know several of you are older than me. Several of you are younger than me. But I'm going to tell you, it's been a quick 56 years. That's the only thing I have to base it on. I can't tell you if it's going to be a quick 60 because I'm not there yet. But I go and tell you, 56 has gone by quick. it has gone by quick. And you think, this is such a short time. In times of my life, I feel like the week's never going to end or the day's never going to end. But now it's Monday and then it's Sunday. It's just, that's how my weeks feel now as we go along. So we need to realize that anything we deal with here, it is only in this life. When we're gone, it is, and if we've lived faithfully, we're not going to have those pains and sorrows. It's all going to be forgotten. Can you imagine a life without pains and sorrows, aches, pains, trials, those things? What a wonderful life. But you have to work to get there. It doesn't just happen. It doesn't just happen. Our grief is a grief knowing that there's hope. That's why our grief should be and is different as a Christian. Because we know there's hope. There's a lot of people that are just living in the now, living in today, not realizing that there is something awaiting them on the other side. And I'm going to tell you, if they don't make that realization, what waits for them is not going to be rest. It's not going to be peace. It's not going to be blackness. You're not dead just like Rover. That's not how it happens. And we all have the opportunity to learn. You can't tell me that there's someone in Lebanon or Tennessee or probably in the United States that doesn't have the opportunity to learn about God. I'd have a hard time believing that. Now I think there's a lot of variations of that. But if you search the scriptures, you can find out about it. So permission to cry to God. The first word in Lamentations 1:1 is how. How. And that's how most lamenting begins. How did this happen? How did I let this happen? How did I get here? The author is asking how. How could this be? How lonely sits the city. It was great. We were God's chosen people. How are we where we're at now? How did this happen? How can such a busy, prosperous city be like a widow? How can the princess become a slave? The author wants the Lord to see what they are experiencing, what they're dealing with, what they're going through. In verse 4, it says, her priests sigh, her virgins are afflicted, and she is in bitterness. Everyone is upset and grieving. It's not a good time. Not a good time at all. In verse 12, it says, if there is any sorrow like my sorrow, which has been brought on me. He's saying there's no sorrow like my sorrow. I want you to think about that just for a second as you've dealt with things in your life. Did that ever cross your mind? Nobody's got it as bad as me. There's no, what makes us think that our sorrow or our grief is unique? Goes back to that old joke, about minor surgery and major surgery. If it's on me, it's major. And if it's on you, it's pretty minor. Same thing with our sorrow. Same thing with we're dealing with our griefs. What makes us think that what I'm dealing with is unique? In Ecclesiastes 1:9, it says there is nothing new under the sun. And I'm going to tell you, there's no new griefs under the sun either. No new sins, no new griefs. No new hardships, different variations, probably so. Nothing unique about your sorrow because someone's dealt with it. And I'm going to tell you, if you look back, if you were able to look back, I guarantee you there was a faithful Christian that made it through it. And I'm going to tell you, if you look back, there's going to be some people that didn't make it through it. Not saying it's new, though. Not saying it's new. You might be familiar with Aesop. It's Aesop. I would say Aesop, but it's pronounced Aesop. Aesop's Fables, that book. And there's a terminology that comes from that, or a saying that comes from that, and it says there is always someone worse off than yourself. So he wrote a fable during the 6th century BC. That fable is called The Hare and the Frog. And I'll give you a quick synopsis of that. So the hares were upset because they were scared of everything. Noises, everything. They take off running, and they said, this is a terrible life. I think we should end it. So as the hares were scurrying off to figure out how they were going to end their lives, they came across a pond, and some frogs and their family saw the hares, jumped in the pond, and hid in the mud. And the hare said, life, not so bad. Someone's actually more scared than we are. So that's where that saying comes from, if you hadn't heard that. But there's always someone worse off than yourself. In this case, the hare said, I think we're okay. We don't have to end it. The frogs are worse off than we are. But your sorrow and pain is not unique. Continuing in verse 13, it says, He has made me desolate and faint all the day. In verse 16, for these things I weep, my eye overflows with water. It is a complete outcry of grief and emotions to God. And the crazy thing is we know why. It's not crazy. We knew why. They knew why. Heart is overturned with me, for I have been very rebellious. There's the answer. I'm grieving. This is terrible, but I know why. I have been rebellious. They are crying for what they had done, and they understand what the cause is completely. They know. They know. But I'm going to tell you, they realize that God is still the important thing. They caused it, yet they still cried to God. When we have those hardships, even if we cause them on ourselves, is that our attitude? Do we cry to God and we say, that was terrible, Lord. I don't know what I was thinking. Please forgive me. Get me through this. Is that what we do? Is that our attitude? Or do we have an attitude of complaining? I can't believe this happened to me. You know what happened. Do we cry to God knowing what we've done or caused? Do we realize that He's going to get us through it? A lot of people don't. A lot of people don't have Him, don't realize He's there for them. They were crying out because of their sins. But we also need to cry to God in situations where, it wasn't anything that we did. If we're still grieving, it's not something I caused upon myself, but maybe we're sad for a brother or sister or a friend, or maybe our friend doesn't know God and is resistant to God. That's sad. We can grieve about that. We can grieve about that. In John 11:35, it says, Jesus wept. Jesus didn't weep because of something He caused. He was upset over, them being sad over Lazarus dying. Of course, He knew what was fixing to happen, but he still felt what they felt. The human side of Him felt what they felt, and He grieved with them. He wept with them. He wept with them. Cry to God, even though it may not have been something you've done, but you can still cry to God for somebody else about that sadness. The idea is to cry to God, and that's where the comfort lays. And that crying out needs to be different from complaining, of course. Complaining is not lamenting. If I'm just running to someone and saying, I did this and I can't believe they caught me, that's not the situation you want to be in. But the author is crying out to God, not to those around, and he knows God is the answer. He knows those around him may support him, but they're not going to get him out of that situation, not going to get them out of that situation. They know what has to happen. Lamenting is faith-filled and complaining is faithless. You might just be mad you got caught, in that situation. In Lamentations 1:18, it says, the Lord is righteous, for I rebelled against his commandments. God's right. I rebelled. Here we are. Their cries were not a rejection of the Lord. They're not criticizing God or challenging his authority. They're taking their pain to the Lord while acknowledging that he is right. We did it. We're sorry. We know while we're in this situation, help us, comfort us. Right now I have no comfort. There's no comfort in anything in my life, and I can't see where it's at, so I need you to show me. I need you to show me. In Galatians 6:17 says, do not be deceived. God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. They were reaping what they had sown. Reaping what they had sown. And they realized it. They realized it. They had the right attitude. The Lord's not done me wrong, even though I'm filled with sorrow and grief. Jeremiah had preached to them for 40 years. Can you imagine? 40 years telling them, this is fixing to happen. You better repent and change your ways. This is fixing to happen. I'm not sure what the idea was. They knew it was going to happen. And when it did happen, they're like, it happened. It happened. But we know how to get out of it. We know who to go to. We know who the comforter is. We know who's going to help us. Just like we need to know that. I warned Jason this. I got 5 conclusion slides. So what should we do when sorrow and grief comes into our lives? We need to allow that grief to speak. We need to work through it. Realize it and realize there is a route to get through that hardship. In 1 Corinthians 10:13, it says, we're not going to experience more than we can bear. It may take you to the limit, but it's not going to be more than you can bear. And I'm going to tell you, everybody's level of tolerance is probably different. So I've known some people that some really, really bad things have happened, yet they stayed faithful. We're not going to have more than we can bear. And we have multiple examples of that. Job in Job 3 crying out after all of his losses and the suffering, to his body. And then you have David crying out in Psalms, multiple Psalms about, what he had done, trials that they were going through. And then, of course, we have the book of Jeremiah, for 40 years crying out. And people need to express their grief, and we don't need to try to fix them, because I'm going to tell you, a lot of times we can't fix them. Only God can fix them. No, we can help. There's no doubt about it. But as far as fixing that problem, finding that true comfort, God is the one that's going to provide it. God is the one who's going to provide. And we need to follow the example of the scriptures. And in Romans 12:15, it says, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Sometimes the only thing to do is listen and weep with those that are weeping. That's what Jesus did, right? When Lazarus died. He knew what was going to happen, but he was still there. And a lot of times that's what we need to do. We just need to listen and be supportive. There's a skit that came back or that was out years ago, and it still cracks me up when I look at it. And it's a husband and wife sitting on the couch talking, and she has a literal nail in the middle of her forehead. And she says, sometimes it's just unbearable. Sometimes what I'm dealing with is unbearable. And the husband's like, it might be the nail. And she says, it's not the nail. I just need you to listen to me. As a Christian, sometimes we just need to listen. We just need to listen. We need to be there, and we need to be supportive. In 1 Corinthians 3:6, it says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. God's going to give the comfort also in this situation. Listen, support, weep. God will provide the comfort. And in James 1:13 it says, no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. In our pain, we need to remember that God didn't cause it. He has not done anything wrong by us. Most times we've gotten ourselves in that situation when it's us personally. Complaining to some extent implies that God has done us wrong. If you were to take, if you had the justice scale out there and you started weighing, the bad things you had to deal with the blessings you've received, it wouldn't even be close. Wouldn't even be close. You need a lot of room on that blessing side. A whole lot of room. And in Proverbs 15:29, it says, the Lord is far from the wicked, but he hears the prayer of the righteous. We need to go to God in prayer. Lamenting is to take that pain to God, and you can be honest with God. I'm not sure why anyone would try to hide anything, because he already knows, but he still wants you to bring it to him. It's still your choice to bring it to him. And you can be honest with others. We don't have to hide what we're going through. This room is filled with people that will help you or others when they're having a hard time. I don't think there's anyone in here that would say no. Nobody in here would say no. Tell God your sorrows and ask him, how could this be? More than likely you played a part in it when you're dealing with that grief. Now, it may just be grief of someone else. That'd be the difference. But it's something you're dealing with yourself. More than likely, you know the answer. You know how it happened. Ask him to see your suffering and tell him what you're going through. Lamenting takes your pain to God. And I'm going to tell you, no one else is more ready or more equipped to walk with you in grief than Jesus. No one's more able to do that. He is the man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. We sang that this morning before the Lord's Supper. In Isaiah 53:3, it says, he is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He had it, didn't he? And lived a perfect life and resisted and fought on and became our mediator so that we have the opportunity to be with God in heaven, so we can have forgiveness of sins. Don't let your pride or anything else come between you and God. Some people are prideful. They just are. And they think they can do it on their own. And some things maybe you can, but I'm going to tell you, if you go to God, it's going to be easier what you can do. He's going to get you through it. Let him know. Because I'm going to tell you, he already knows. But like I said a second ago, he wants you to come to him. It's your choice to come to him. Let him help. I appreciate you listening. If there are those here tonight that have something on their hearts that they want to get off, they're grieving something, if you want us to pray with you, we can do that. We can listen, and we're here to help. We ask that you don't hesitate, don't wait. Come forward while we stand and sing the song selected. Have you